Hello, everyone. We'll get started as people continue to sign on. Welcome, everyone, to Who is Paid a Living Wage in New York State, examining gaps and modeling alternatives using the Cornell ILR Wage Atlas. My name is Megan Thorsfeld. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Applied Research on Work here at Cornell's Industrial Labor Relations School. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring the Cornell ILR Wage Atlas, a tool that was developed by Cornell researchers and High Road Fellows to answer the question, who in New York State has access to a wage that covers their necessary living expenses? In today's program, we will outline what a living wage is, show how to use the Living Wage or the Wage Atlas to find detailed wage data by profession and different demographic variables at the county and regional levels in New York State. We'll also talk to advocates who have used the tool to better understand the constraints and opportunities in their communities. Here to do just that, we have Dr. Russell Weaver, the Director of Research at ILR's Buffalo CoLab and the architect of the Wage Atlas. Dr. Weaver is the lead author of Shrinking Cities, Understanding Urban Decline in the United States. We also have Yannet Lathrop, a Senior Researcher and Policy Analyst for the National Employment Law Project. Ms. Lathrop is an expert on minimum wage and preemption policies. Her work has appeared in local, national, and international media. And Dr. Karen King, Commissioner of Public Advocacy for Erie County and the Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. Dr. King leads the commission and its work to provide resources to women and girls of Erie County to ensure that they participate fully in matters that have an impact on their lives and toward the elimination of all gender-based discrimination and the promotion of women's economic, societal, and political empowerment. Welcome, Rusty, Yannet, and Karen. We're going to start with a broad question for framing. And Yannet, I'd love to turn to you. If you could speak a little bit about what is a living wage, how is it different from a minimum wage, and why is that distinction important?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So a living wage is sort of a concept. It's an hourly wage that allows a worker to live in economic security with just one full-time job. A minimum wage, on the other hand, is a wage floor that is adopted by legislation or by citizen-initiated ballot measure that sets the lowest pay that an employer can legally pay their employee. So one is a concept, the other one is a law. Obviously the difference here to understand why this is important is because, again, one is a concept, the other one's a law. So as a law, the minimum wage is legally enforceable. The living wage, on the other hand, it's something that we would aspire to meet, but there's nothing in the law that says that you have to pay a living wage to anybody at this point, at least. Obviously, advocates want to see the minimum wage become a living wage, but we're not at that point yet. There are a few other differences. The living wage is based on household size, location. For example, the minimum wage is not based on that. It's one single wage for anybody, regardless of family composition, where in the state or in the country they live. And then the last thing I'll say is that the living wage is based on what it costs, what basic necessities cost. The minimum wage, again, is not really based on that. It's a number that advocates in consultation with or in negotiations with legislators, for example, may pick, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what it takes to make ends meet.
Great, thank you. And that's really interesting to think about how we sort of move from living wage idea to specific minimum wage policies. And in that vein, Karen, I'd love to ask you about in your role as Executive Director for the Erie County Commission on Women, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of having these localized and disaggregated by demographics wages on both minimum wage and living wage.
Well, certainly with regards to the work we do around the persistent gender wage gap, we ideally want to gather data that reflects the immediate region that we're living in. And being in New York State, when you look at aggregate data, of course, it's skewed by the numbers and the demographics for downstate in the New York metropolitan area. And there's a lot of distance between that region Central New York, the North Country, and Western New York. And Western New York has some very specific factors that influence wages in terms of industry, location, what drives wages. So all this information, to have it available and disaggregated and to have it very specific to the region is incredibly illuminating, and it's very helpful in terms of when we're discussing policy. And when we say the wage gap, I mean, that covers a lot of territory. And if it's, I don't know, what's the average this year? Is it 82 cents, 84 cents, somewhere in that neighborhood? But in Western New York, it's different because of the circumstances. So to have that data available and to have it available in a timely fashion, as well as the opportunity to have that information intersect with other variables, is really what we're trying to achieve. So we can present a much more contextualized as well as comprehensive picture of how women are situated within wage earning work here in Western New York.
Thanks. And we're going to talk and dive into specific policy in a little bit. And first, I want to ask Rusty if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of the Living Wage Atlas, what it is, why it was developed, and how it's different from other wage calculators.
Sure, thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Really, Dr. King touched on the motivations for why we ended up developing this tool. For those other data junkies out there who wait for the first Friday of every month to see the employment situation from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the one where we get all of our unemployment data from to know, timely whether or not, say, policies at the Fed are working to curb inflation or anything like that. The power of that tool, in addition to being monthly and giving us real-time information, is that it combines data from two sources. There are always two surveys that happen with that employment situation. One is of employers, and that's where we get all of the data on wages, the number of jobs being created or lost by industry, and all of those headline capturing numbers. But then there's also a survey of households and workers that give us the detailed demographic information so that we can know if the labor market is working for everybody in an even way, or whether there are disparities by race, gender, even age or industry for that Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly employment situation report. In New York State and in any other state, presumably, there's great information from that program, from the BLS program, on wages that's captured at the employer level. So for example, the New York State Department of Labor has a wonderful occupational wage tool, data visualization, where anyone can log in and see the distribution of wages for a single occupation in a given region. But that, again, is employer-side data that doesn't disaggregate any of that information. So we don't know who is making those wages, if everybody is earning at that level, or if there are market disparities in specific industries or occupations. And so our goal was to create a supplement to that tool that would capture worker-side data, self-reported information from individual workers that would allow us to assess, as Dr. King said, disparities, whether they're geographically based, gender-based, or race-based. And then beyond that, we also wanted something that could inform policy discussions. If, for example, the worker side data shows that there are persistent disparities, then perhaps it can illuminate some strategies for trying to even out those disparities over time. So those are really the motivating factors here, trying to create a well-rounded picture of work and employment and wages in New York State.
Thanks, Rusty. And with that, let's dive in and show people sort of how the tool works and start getting a feel for all of the rich data that we have in the tool.
Sounds great. Thank you. So we will drop a link to this in the chat as we go along here. But the Wage Atlas itself is a collection of tools. Now, before we get into the fun stuff and start exploring some data, I've got to go with all the disclaimers and the boring stuff, which is, again, with that employment situation report from the BLS, there's a household survey and an employer survey. Both are run by the BLS and Census Bureau in collaboration. And so those are easy to port together in that monthly report from the BLS. When it comes to worker side data for wages in smaller geographies, subnational geographies like New York State, the BLS data cannot be disaggregated in a way that gives us, again, a robust picture geographically, like the one Dr. King was talking about in her opening remarks of being able to localize the information. However, there is a powerful U.S. Census Bureau data program called the American Community Survey. This is where we get our top line findings on things like poverty rates and the changing demographic composition of places over time. That American Community Survey has a variant called the public use microdata samples, where instead of giving us data that's aggregated for a particular region, we get a data table where each row is a person. We get self-reported information from individual workers in New York State, where they're reporting not only their job and occupation, how much they're earning, but also things like Yannet was talking about, the number of folks in their household, whether they have children, how many working adults there are, which allows us to see, potentially what those workers' living wages would be given where they live and who lives in their household. So the data that power these tools come from that U.S. Census Bureau American Community Survey public use microdata samples. And I'll just direct everyone at the outset that at the very top of the website for the Wage Atlas, we have an About and FAQ section, and you'll get a detailed description here of the data that we use to the source data for these tools, how we've processed them to generate the wage levels and everything else that you can see, as well as notes on the geography, the geographic units that you'll take a look at in the Atlas. And I'll come back to this section in a moment, but we also have a disclaimer, a lot to read here if you're really interested in the details, but we also have a disclaimer here saying that these are sample data. They're based on self-reported information from workers. We do put a lot of guards in place so that when sample sizes get smaller and smaller, the more you use filters that are available in the tools, we try to suppress some information that's based just on too little information. But we can't do that perfectly. And so there are always going to be situations where the more filters you use, the fewer people that are going to be powering the results that you see. And so just approach that with some caution. If you see something that looks too difficult to believe, maybe jump over to the DOL occupational wage data and make a comparison. So that's just something to keep in mind. I would strongly encourage folks that do want to use these tools to read at least some of the methodology and all of the FAQs here in this section. But because we only have a limited amount of time today, I'll jump right into the tools and the data. When you land on the site, you'll see a menu across the top with 5 different buckets, basically, which correspond to 5 different functions that the Wage Atlas can perform. The most basic and the default view at the home screen shows a schedule of wages by occupation across New York State, and it summarizes the median effective wage, again, from that self-reported worker data across the state. There are a couple of filters in the bottom left-hand corner that will allow you to adjust and modify the schedule and the map above it by region, by worker gender, worker race, ethnicity, and education level. To start off, before I get into any of these filters or why they're set the way that they are, I'll just say that the wage schedule on the right does cover every occupation for which we have a relatively decent sample, enough of a sample, enough respondents to be able to generate a distribution of wages. And so here in the schedule, we show the 25th percentile wage, the median wage, which is what is mapped over here, and the 75th percentile wage. This just gives you a way to very quickly see what are the top paid occupations or the top compensated occupations in New York State versus what are the worst or the least compensated positions. And then we can start to, again, get more specific here. So the filters on the left-hand side would allow us to answer questions such as, well, what is the top occupation? Where can I potentially earn the most money if I don't have a college degree? Now you'll see that some of these filters are grouped. This was just due to some of the sample size limitations that I mentioned earlier. There are going to be other portions of the Atlas and other tools that I'll get to momentarily where we don't need to use these groupings. But at least for right now, to avoid dropping off entirely and having to suppress all the data because we don't have enough combinations of occupation, gender, race, ethnicity, and education levels to, again, provide robust or reliable data, some of these filters are grouped. And again, this is detailed in that lengthy methodology section that I referred you to earlier. But getting back to the question, if we wanted to know what are the best paid positions for somebody without a college degree in New York State, we can set the filter here. You'll notice that the map changes considerably. We go from a lot of green to a lot of, again, lower median wages. So that changes right away. But then we can take a look at the wage schedule over here and answer that question. So we see that for workers without a college degree in New York State, some of the best paid positions are in law enforcement, in the tech sector, in finance, and a lot of unionized jobs or jobs that tend to be highly unionized show up in the upper reaches of this wage schedule as well. So again, a very simple, straightforward question that we can use one of these drop-down bars over here to filter out and get a pretty quick answer to. But to get into the weeds a little bit more, you'll notice I'm going to go through this just exercising a couple of the different options for manipulating these views. I'll try to mention every one when I do. But anytime you have a filter enabled, if you hover over it, it's very small. You might have a difficult time seeing it on your screen right now, but you'll see that there's a red X that will sometimes appear when you hover over a portion of these tools. It's not always on all of the filters. And so that just tells you have something checked. You have a filter enabled. So you can always get rid of that by clicking on the little icon with the red X. There are two other ways to reset all of the filters. There's a big button down here that will allow you to do that if you're using multiple filters in combination. And then at the bottom of the screen, there's a little back arrow as well with a line on the left-hand side that will just take you back to the very original view when you first land on the tools. So here I'm just going to disable this one filter since it's the only one I used by clicking on the red X. You'll see that's gone after we've clicked it. And now we're back to the original view. All right, so let's get a little bit more specific. You'll see that there's a search box in the top right-hand side of this. If I don't want to look through this entire wage schedule for a position that I'm interested in studying, let's say that we're interested in wait staff and servers at restaurants in New York State. If I come up and type a keyword, that will filter this wage schedule down to just the occupations that match my keyword search. And so here, if we look at self-reported wages for waiters and waitresses in New York State, we have a median effective wage. Again, this is based on self-reported information on total earnings and total hours worked, a median wage of just over the minimum wage for much of New York State. The map changes to a lot of redder hues and redder shades, suggesting that median wages for this occupation are lower than the median wages for all occupations before we place this filter. And so this just gives us a way to zero in on where a specific type of worker, a specific occupation is earning high or low wages, again, based on this comparison to the national median. So if we take a look at that and want to zoom in to, say, the 5 boroughs of New York City, we can set one of our geographic filters over on the left-hand side. And you see that the map is pretty much entirely in shades of red or orange, indicating that this is a position that is compensated at relatively low levels in New York State, but we can see how, just by hovering over each borough, how the median wage varies across the New York City labor market region. If we wanted to go back and start to look at a different occupation, for example, and I should note too, I looked at this one position here as an example. There are a lot of policy proposals flying around in New York State right now, given the time of the year and the work on the budget. Something that you might have seen a lot is a proposal for one fair wage, which would impact how we currently tier and segregate a minimum wage from a tipped minimum wage. So this is a relevant position for looking at that particular policy proposal. Again, going back to the motivations for this tool, one is to have that balance of worker side data. Another is to be able to inform discussions like ongoing policy debates here in New York State. That being said, if we want to go back and we want to scrap all of these filters, I'll use one of the other methods that we talked about a moment ago. At the bottom toolbar here, this little back arrow with the line to reset our view back to having no filters, just the default view from where we are. We can zoom in on a question that might be more relevant to, say, a researcher like Dr. King, who's interested in the gender wage gap in Western New York. We might start off by going to that region. So we can select the Western New York labor market region. Everything on the tool will update automatically once you make that selection. So we'll zoom into the Western New York labor market here. We'll also update our wage schedule to include only workers who live in this region. And now we can start to look for, say, evidence of a gender wage gap at the occupational scale. So when we do filter down to Western New York, the top paid position in Western New York based on median wage is a physician. So let's just say that I'm interested in studying that occupation right now. If I type in Physicians, just like we did with wait staff earlier, it will narrow this wage schedule down to just folks who self-report that this is their occupation as a physician. We can see that the median wage in this labor market region for physicians, based on, again, this worker side self-reported data, is about $75 per hour. If we wanted to see if there was a gender wage gap or a gender disparity in this occupational level, we could use the tools on the left, the filters, to look for the median wage earned by a male who identifies as a physician, which goes up to about $98. And then we could compare that to women who identify as physicians in the Census Bureau data and see that that drops down to just under $72. So that's the same position, same occupation, same region. We're controlling for geography and position, and we can see a pretty big gap in the median effective earnings for folks who have this particular occupation.
Thanks, Rusty. I want to pause there. And
Sure.
Karen, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how the wage atlas can tell us and what it can tell us about the gender wage gap in Western New York or elsewhere, and what other inequalities you might be able to explore.
Well, this is a great example of the discussion around wage or occupation segregation as a rationale to explain the wage gap. Here you've got physicians, which is high status, high paying, and you can see the glaring difference in pay between women physicians and male physicians. What happened?
Sorry, I just, while you were talking, I just added some background too. So this is an ongoing issue in Western New York, physician compensation. So just for some context.
Right. So even in high status, high paying professions like law, like medicine, women are still making significantly less than their male counterparts. So everything cannot be explained away by a career trajectory or choice, right? Occupational segregation. I'm not saying it's not valid, but there's much more to this conversation. And what's interesting here, Rusty, can you hover over, like, this red area represents Cattaraugus. Okay, so rural community, under-resourced community. It's not Erie County, it's another county, but of course it makes up the Western New York region, which adds more context to the fact that while in the Buffalo metro and suburban areas, you'll see that the wage goes up significantly, but we also are contending with an incredible disparity within the region. And the region is experiencing a high level of poverty in its rural communities, as well as parts of the city of Buffalo. So having all of this information at our fingertips really helps us get a much clearer picture, or I says, a more of a contextualized picture of what's going on in the region. But I love that you can take the occupation and see blatantly that women are making significantly less money, women physicians, than male physicians. And then, of course, you can take a deeper dive and say, well, the female or the women physicians don't typically go into surgery. They go into pediatrics, or, then you get into that whole discussion. So I don't know how deep we could go, but clearly it cannot be fully explained away by occupational choice.
Thanks, Karen. And yeah, that question of how deep can we go? We're always looking for new ways to add to the tool, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Rusty, can you talk a little bit about the change in the output you've seen from last year to this year with the living wage calculator?
Sure. So this is a tool that we did launch last year. So we're now relaunching it with updated data. The U.S. Census Bureau just released its new vintage of the public use microdata samples that we draw on that came out in January. But probably one of the bigger changes year to year, we do source data from the U.S. Census Bureau, but also, I'll go to it in just a second here, we also source data from the MIT Living Wage Calculator. For those on the call who are familiar with this tool, it's become the go-to or gold standard of quantifying what a living wage would look like at the county, metropolitan, or state level across the United States. And it's a calculator or a tool that, as Yannet introduced for us, it doesn't just provide or spit out one number saying that $20 is a living wage in this location. it takes context and nuance into consideration. It provides a schedule of wages for what a living wage would look like for someone based on the number of children who are in their household, the number of adults who are in their household, and the number of adults who are working in that household. And so the living wage varies. In New York State, it can vary from I think the current statewide living wage from the MIT calculator for a single adult with no dependents right now is just north of $26 per hour. However, if you're a single adult with 3 kids, that number jumps up to about $83 per hour. So it takes that context into consideration. So we do pull in that data. As I said, all of the data that we have from workers give us all of the data points that we need to understand how that worker would match up with the MIT Living Wage calculator by, again, identifying the number of children, adults, and working adults in their household. And so we can look to see if a worker is earning at or above their geographically and household-based MIT Living Wage. Now, that is where we saw some of the biggest changes year to year since we launched this last year. Again, in the documentation for this tool in that About an FAQ section, we provide a more in-depth look at this. But in New York State, just since last year, since 2023, the MIT living wage for a single adult with no dependents in New York State was just north of $21 an hour, about $21.50 per hour. Right now, MIT re-released its data in February with an update. The current living wage for that same person went up by over $5 an hour to $26.86. And so what we're seeing here is intense pressure in New York State on the cost of living. At the county scale, there are some counties like Hamilton in the North Country, for example, where in the MIT calculator, the difference from the living wage level for a single adult with no dependents last year to this year increased by nearly $8 an hour. And so what we're seeing is that cost of living is becoming more and more of an issue to identify whether or not workers are earning a living wage. So that's, for sure, probably the biggest change that we've noticed in relaunching this tool for its second iteration.
That's helpful. And that's really, captures sort of, I think, what people feel and are experiencing, that increase to cost of living. I noticed, and our audience might notice, that you've also got the living wage industries and the compute living wage probability tabs. Can you walk us through how those work?
Yes. So very quickly, we'll start on this jobs one. So the next tool, this takes all of the occupational data that you just saw on the last portion of the atlas, and it just attaches it to that worker level MIT living wage from the current February edition of their calculator. So it just compares what the worker's effective wage is to what their MIT living wage is. And then it maps out where workers in New York are earning at or above their living wage. At the occupational schedule on the right, instead of presenting wages or median wages, it just then presents the fraction of workers who are earning at or above their living wage. And so this goes back to, again, if we want to answer simple questions, like if I don't have a college degree, what's my best chance of earning a living wage in New York State? We can see which occupations for workers without a college degree are paying at or above a living wage for that worker. All of the same filters exist here, so we can filter this out by region, gender, race, ethnicity. We can use these in combination, so it's not either or. If we want to look at, say, women who do not have a college degree and look for the occupations that are most likely to pay a living wage there, everything will update based on these filters. So we can use these in combination. And just like we can answer the question of which occupations are the best for paying a living wage given these filters, we can scroll the whole way to the bottom and see which ones are the worst. And one thing that we observed time over time, this happened in our first version of this wage atlas, and it's happening now as well, is that what tends to be at the bottom of this list are occupations that are in the personal care services and care sectors of our economy. These are positions that appear to be relatively devalued in the grand scheme of things because so few workers in these occupations are earning a living wage. To go to what Megan was just saying, there are some other tools here. We also break this data down by industry. So if the occupational scale is a bit overwhelming or too much, we just take all of that data and re-aggregate it by industry to see which industries have the highest concentrations of sub-living wage employees. versus the fewest sub-living wage employees. All of the same filters exist here that we can use to search by gender, race, ethnicity, education, and geography in whatever combination we would like. But then the real deep dive comes with computing the probability of earning a living wage. So this is a tool that doesn't have the fancy maps, it doesn't have the wage schedule or anything like that, but it does take all data from workers, all self-reported data from non-self-employed workers in New York State, and it just spits out the fraction of those workers who are earning at or above their living wage. So in New York State as a whole, about half of employees in New York State are currently earning a living wage, which means the other half aren't. But if we want to see how this likelihood or this probability changes for different types of individuals, we can see that this bar graph is surrounded by a number of different filters. So if we wanted to change this by region and say, what is the probability of earning a living wage, say, in the New York City metro or in the New York City labor market, we can select that geography and see how that likelihood changes. It doesn't change by much, but this is perhaps an indicator of how expensive it is to live downstate in New York City, that we see the likelihood of earning a living wage in this particular labor market region drops below the statewide average. Now, if we wanted to see how having children affects this, we can come down to this filter and say, well, what if we have children in our household? Then we see this probability of earning a living wage decline dramatically. If we wanted to go further and push further still, we could think about a household that has just one parent with children. We could select a family household that just has a single householder and no spouse. So your traditional single parent household, here our probability drops down to 20%. If we want to control for the gender of that parent and say, what if it's a single mother household? We can see the probability drop even further. If we wanted to control for race or ethnicity, here's where we don't rely on the same grouped categories, because again, we're not spitting out any information here on wages. This is more of just a relative frequency. So we don't have the same limitations of filtering out some of the data. So if we want to look for a specific type of person, say a Latino single mother who lives in the New York City region, we can see her probability of earning a living wage drops below 14%. And say she doesn't have a college degree, then we can see that number continue to whittle down. And again, we can do this with industry. All of these filters that you can see on the screen can be used in combination to map out the landscape of inequality and disparities in being able to afford basic necessities in New York State. While we're here, I'm going to point out one thing that is also true of all of the other tools that you've seen. So here there are going to be some instances where the more filters we apply, you might start to see this number, you might see it, you might see it drop down to levels that are close to zero, at zero. But if we put a ton of filters on to the point where we just don't have any data to rely on, you're going to see the bar sort of jump all over the place. And so when we get into these situations, this is what I was talking about earlier with that disclaimer, that just be wary of how many filters you're using. It's likely that we either have maybe just one individual in the database that the answers are based on, or no individuals whatsoever, at which point this bar would just sort of vanish altogether. So be wary of those huge jumps as you're using filters. If you get to a point where it seems like you've applied too many or checked too many boxes and you want to start over, you can use the reset buttons that you see on either location in this screen. So again, this is where we can really get down into the weeds and start to look for who is able to afford where they live in New York State versus who isn't, based on all of these categories of data collected by the Census Bureau.
Thanks, Rusty. This is a lot of information. I want to remind the audience that there is a Q&A, which we will be getting to later, but if people have questions as we're going along, please feel free to add those in. I want to pause here and ask both, the whole panel actually about living wage generally and how this, if there's surprises that have popped out to you from this tool, or if this really does align with sort of what you're, unfortunately, possibly align with what you've studied and researched in the past. Yannet, why don't we maybe start with you?
Yeah, so I haven't taken a look at all the occupations in the atlas, but what we did see for the example for servers and bartenders, or actually it was just servers, it aligns with what I know, which is, workers in that occupation typically make just about the minimum wage, not much more. Um, I did not get a chance to really take a look at what the difference was between the percentiles. I only focused on the median, but typically what we do see also is that in many places there's not a whole lot of changes between what the 25th percentile wages to what the median is to what the 75th is. So when we do see that, we typically interpret that as, well, it doesn't really matter like whether or not a worker in the server occupation is working fine dining. It might matter, but it typically, like as far as like in a general sense, if a tipped wage is under the minimum wage, that is going to affect the percentiles, and we can make a case there for why when opponents of the tip of phasing out the tip wage say that like the average is like way above the minimum wage, we can say, well, no, this is not really the case. We can present that information to you and say this is what the data suggests, and that is not really accurate. You're just basing that on fine dining restaurant workers, or it's not like the typical worker that that we should be looking at.
Thanks, Yannet. Was there anything, Karen, that jumped out to you or that sort of underscored what you've seen in your work?
Well, certainly the work that Rusty and I've been engaged in around childcare, when you saw those statistics about the ability to earn a living wage, the childcare provider worker was right in that lowest of low in terms of the ability to, forget about a thriving wage, right? So, and of course, when you look at childcare, that has to be part of this larger discussion regarding the gender wage gap overall and how that plays out. So nothing regrettably shocking, just confirming what we've been seeing.
Thanks, Karen. And I want to, move in a minute to the Wage Atlas also has a robust minimum wage section, which, as Yannet pointed out, we've been talking about living wage, which is sort of the context of the lived experience that we live in and both wages and expenses that we incur. But on the policy side, where we're actually talking about what is the set minimum wage in a locality, in a state, in a in the US, what can we see in the atlas there, Rusty?
All right, so this is a section where if any folks are on that have used the Wage Atlas in the past, this is where we've probably done the most expansion this time around. So the very last header on the websites for the Wage Atlas, this is just a function of what the tool ultimately allows you to do, but there's a button called Raise the New York State Minimum Wage, where it allows the user to play policymaker effectively and to set a new minimum wage for New York State to see who might be affected by that change. Now, before we do that, the interface, the default interface for the tool just tries to give a profile of who are current minimum wage workers, again, based on current minimum wage levels, $16 downstate, $15 upstate in New York State. And so the map just tries to show the distribution of where minimum wage workers are in New York. And then on the right-hand side, we can see that overall, we estimate that about 22% of employees, again, not the self-employed, but employees at establishments are minimum wage workers in the state. And then we break that universe down by race and ethnicity and by age. And then we also show how this overall average varies by race, ethnicity, and gender. So this is just a little trick that no one necessarily has to use, but for visual explanation, it will allow me to show things a little bit more clearly. So these bars, you see the sort of pinkish and greenish colors over here, are part of the legend that's underneath the map. If you click on any legend item, it just highlights it on the screen. So if that way, again, I can talk through it in a bit more visual way. But if we think that the overall likelihood of being a minimum wage worker in New York State is about 22%, we can see that that only holds really for one group. For folks who identify to the Census Bureau as either white women or white men, that's where we see that overall average kind of in play. So for, again, workers who identify as white women, it's about 20% of all such employees who are identified as likely minimum wage workers in the census data. For white men, it's about 16.5%. Every other breakdown here has a slightly higher than average likelihood of being a minimum wage worker, with Latina women being the most likely in New York State, again, based on self-reported data to the US Census Bureau. If you ever want to undo one of these things where you don't know why everything is grayed out, just find where it's clicked on the tool and click it again, and then everything will go back to normal. So that's one way to use this. The other, this is a bit of a myth-busting attempt to show who minimum wage workers are. A lot of the popular rhetoric and the popular discourse around minimum wage suggests that most minimum wage workers are, say, teenagers working in fast food restaurants or at convenience stores or things like that. And so the bottom pie charts on this tool just break down the actual minimum wage workforce in New York State. And it shows that predominantly minimum wage workers tend to be folks in their 30s through their 50s. There are a number of younger individuals. About a quarter of minimum wage workers in New York State are younger individuals. But more likely it's someone who's been out of school for a long time, someone who's been in the workforce for quite a bit. So a bit of a myth-busting quality to this breakdown of the minimum wage workforce by age. You can also see this breakdown by race ethnicity, where we see that the plurality of minimum wage workers in New York State, nearly a majority, identify as white. And so that is our minimum wage workforce as it exists. We can go a little bit deeper into that and see the industries that are likely to have the highest concentrations of minimum wage workers. Here, again, just for ease of communication, I'll highlight those minimum wage workers so that you can see where they are. Again, compared to the statewide average of about 22% of the workforce, we can see some industries, agriculture, and one of the most heavily, I'd say, subsidized industries that we see in New York State of accommodation and food services. Nearly 50% of employees in that industry are likely minimum wage workers. If we go down to our most prominent sector in New York State, health and social assistance, that's about average. The other thing that this second screen does for the breakdown of minimum wage workers is just show, like we did with race, ethnicity, and gender on the past screen, the likelihood of earning a minimum wage by age or generation. And so here's where that myth kind of comes to life, is that younger folks are much more likely than their counterparts to earn a minimum wage. But again, as a fraction of the workforce, relatively small fraction. So they have a higher propensity to earn a minimum wage, but they don't by any means constitute the majority or most minimum wage workers, as the data make pretty clear. The only other age group with a higher than average likelihood of earning a minimum wage in New York State are older New Yorkers, which has been an ongoing trend where we see older individuals having to re-enter the workforce because of something we mentioned earlier, the rising cost of living in New York State. So we can see a sort of bookend here with the most likely groups to earn a minimum wage are at both ends of the age continuum. Now, if we get to some of the expansions that I had mentioned earlier, after we break down the minimum wage workforce in New York State, now we can play policymaker and think about what would it look like if we set a new minimum wage, who would benefit, where would workers benefit, what industries would benefit, and what changes might we see in the economy as a result of that. This interface is a relatively complex one, but we highlight the point of intervention for the user at the top left in yellow. So here it says that you can come in and set a new minimum wage. By default, we have this set at $21.25, just because for folks who have been following this, there is an active bill in the New York State legislature right now, the Raise the Wage Act. that would try to gradually increase the statewide minimum wage to this level of 21.25 before then coupling it to productivity and inflation so that it continues to keep pace with those data points going forward. So by default, I just pulled that in since it is under ongoing investigation by our New York State Legislature right now. But as I'll demonstrate in a second, you can change this to any value you would like. So whatever the value is here, the rest of the tools are based off of that entered value. So the map shows the distribution of workers, the percentage of workers who are currently earning below this level based on their self-reported data. The big circle in the middle, for lack of a better word, just shows the size of the universe of workers who might benefit from this minimum wage. Our estimates, again, these are employees, so the asterisk here just means that self-employed workers are excluded from this analysis. So of employees, just north of 3 million employees in New York are estimated to earn below this level currently. So over a third of the workforce could benefit from this higher minimum wage proposal. We already saw this in one piece of the atlas that about half of New Yorkers right now are estimated to be earning at or above their MIT living wage for their household and geography of residence. Under a minimum wage of 21.25, we estimate that would increase to almost 2/3 of the workforce. So going from 1/2 to 2/3 is a pretty big change. And then below, just like we did for the universe of minimum wage workers, we break down this universe of sub 21.25 earners by race, ethnicity, and gender, as well as age. And so again, comporting with what we know about the minimum wage workforce from the prior screens, the groups to benefit most, the largest beneficiaries would be adults in their 30s or 40s, as well as individuals who identify as white, particularly women. But this is something where we can find workers from all across these categories of age, race, and gender would benefit from a higher minimum wage. We can go further here. So you'll see a bunch of new buttons pop up when you go into this simulation mode of the tool. We can do a breakdown also by industry. If we scroll down through this, we can see that those 3.2 million workers roughly who are estimated to earn below 21.25, the biggest industry that would be affected is our biggest industry in New York State, healthcare and social assistance. This doesn't come as a surprise. These aren't percentages. These are just counts, numbers of workers. So this is like if you ever look at a state map that just shows you the number of something across states, you always see the most stuff in California, New York, Florida, and Texas because they're the biggest states. So we should expect to see the biggest impact in our biggest industries by number. But this, again, is just meant to show that this is a policy or a change that would benefit workers in every industry, just in different magnitudes. We can also see how that likelihood of earning a living wage would change by race, ethnicity. So just like we did on the main simulation screen, we showed the overall change in living wage, in earning a living wage for all workers in New York. We can now break this out by race, ethnicity, and see what fraction of workers in each racial or ethnic group tracked by the Census Bureau currently earns at or above their living wage versus the fraction that would earn their living wage under this new proposed minimum wage. So we can see how that results in some big changes for certain groups, and in other groups, the uptick might be a bit smaller. So it has the potential to potentially close some earnings gaps by race and ethnicity. But then beyond this, we ported in data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis to think about, what might this do for the economy as a whole? Now I'll preface this by saying it imagines a frictionless world, right? Where if we were to up the minimum wage and pay all workers who are currently earning below the proposed minimum wage at this level, it just thinks of each of those as an industry-specific investment in the workforce that would generate changes throughout the economy. And so here, the simple way that these are calculated for every worker who is estimated to earn below 21.25, we take their current earnings as they exist, and then we simulate what those earnings would be based on their self-reported hours and weeks worked at a wage of 21.25. And so that difference we can think of as an investment in that worker. And we can think of this total investment up here as an investment in all workers earning below 21.25. So if we suddenly raised everyone's pay to this level of 21.25 who's below it, that would be an investment in New York State's workers of about $49 billion. And we break that out by industry in this chart. Again, you can just scroll down and see where some of the biggest changes would take shape. To Yannet's point, one of the biggest changes of workers earning generally right around the minimum wage is in food and accommodation services and wait staff. So we can see these by industry, but then we try to take this one step further with economic multiplier data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We conceptualize each one of these bars here as an independent investment into its parent industry, or the industry on the left-hand side. And so with that, we can use economic multiplier data to think, what would the overall effect on earnings be in the New York State economy? Basically, what are the reverberation effects? If we increase the wages for minimum wage workers, the assumption is that that's going to put upward pressure on wages throughout the rest of the workforce. And so we try to account for that based on the industry level investments from the last screen. And so this suggests that in addition, including that $49 billion investment into sub 21.25 per hour workers, we could expect total or aggregate earnings in New York State to increase by about $80.5 billion as a result of this change. The next step uses that same Bureau of Economic Analysis data, those same multipliers, to think about, well, that's a lot more money in the economy, which means a lot more disposable income and a lot more consumer spending. So with that, how would those shifts in demand and spending impact the number of jobs in the economy? Again, this is imagining a perfect frictionless world where we can make these changes without, it doesn't factor in any sort of short-term adjustments or issues that might be relevant for some employers that would face thinner margins of raising wages, let's say. So this is, again, just thinking of each one of these as specific industry investment with no friction. That consumer spending that we saw on the last screen would support the net increase in jobs of about 76,000 jobs throughout the economy. So again, we allow you to filter this by region to think about, would this be a policy that would help my constituency in my region, or workers in my labor market, or things of that sort. This is, again, just a thought experiment using real data on economic multipliers by industry to think about how increased earnings throughout the economy would impact spending and would impact jobs. And so again, this is something that we could change the minimum wage up here, the proposed minimum wage, and run through all of these different changes and see how different levels of minimum wage would impact all of these data points. So I'm going to stop here, but I'll just type in another sort of arbitrary number here to show how all of these tools will update based on the minimum wage that you would decide to set.
Thanks, Rusty. Karen, I'm curious what you see as the impacts of raising the minimum wage, or lack thereof, on local economies. I mean, we've got a lot of different figures here. If you could speak a little bit about how those changes do or don't impact at the local level.
Well, it would have a huge impact. I mean, particularly if we're talking about women and women wage earners, because women wage earners are clustered in Western New York around lower wage work. So it would have a huge impact in terms of their ability to thrive. And I guess, I mean, the rationale is if you make more money, you'll contribute more to the economy by spending more money, right? That's the theory, right, Rusty?
Right.
But for women who are living, right on that precipice of barely making ends meet, and don't have a safety net, and make a choice between childcare or putting gas in their car, I mean, those are real things. So more money in their paycheck is going to have a huge impact.
And for folks in the audience who are curious about how to use data like this to inform policy making around minimum wage laws, can you talk about your experience and some of the campaigns you've worked on and how you've used data such as this?
Yeah, I mean, well, I will say that this atlas is so rich in so many good data points that I think it's hard for me to pick one specific one that would be most helpful. But I can think of, for example, the impact on the economy. That's one of the huge things that sometimes when we talk to legislators, they ask, well, what is this going to do to the economy? Is there like something that if you put this money into the pockets of workers, what can I say about what the impact is? So that would be very helpful to highlight that not only do workers themselves, the low-wage workers, benefit, but also the economy as a whole. That's one really great data point I think that would be helpful for those of us who think about the impact of policies on women and people of color who want to see economic policies be equitable. I think the information on the impact on women and people of color of the low wages, for example, and also like the probabilities, all of that can be very helpful to inform that sort of discussion on the potential equity of minimum wage policies. So, and the way that this is the sort of data that I have used for, in support of many campaigns around the country. I don't know which one to pick, obviously, and NELP has been helping many campaigns, including in New York. So yeah, I mean, this is very helpful information that really can inform a lot of these discussions with like with data we can really hopefully change minds.
There's a few specific questions coming in, and Rusty, I want to ask first sort of a logistics question for folks who want to use these tools. I mean, you've got a lot of graphics on here that show tons of different ways to cut or look and slice the data. If people wanted to use those in, let's say, some advocacy materials, like, you know, is that allowed? And how would somebody go about using that from just a purely practical standpoint?
Sure thing. If you don't mind, I'm going to take over the screen again for just a second. To Megan's question, number one, absolutely. I mean, if there's anything in here that's useful to your campaign, your research, and you want it, I mean, there is an option right in the bottom right. If you hover over what looks like the little TV screen, you can export an image, or you can export your findings as a PDF, or port it into PowerPoints as a slide for a presentation. So that's always available down in the bottom right. Other than that, I mean, the answer to what wasn't a yes or no question is yes. I mean, please use anything that you can take here. If you want to use the snipping tool on Windows to take images of it, you know, feel free. This is all public data. It's just public data that we have cut and put together in a way that hopefully makes it a bit more user-friendly. If anyone out there has tried to mess around with the public use microdata samples before from the Census Bureau, there's a bit of a learning curve there. It can be a pretty intense go at it. And so we've just tried to package it in a way that it becomes more useful to you.
Thanks, Rusty. And I believe there's a good way, recommended way to cite the work as well on the About page. So for folks who are doing that, you can check that out. A few other specific questions. Somebody was curious from the audience about how often this is updated, and does it show anything about wages paid to undocumented workers?
Sure. So on that question, number one, in terms of frequency of updates, the new vintage of the main data set that we use from the Census Bureau comes out every January. And so we typically are going to try to have that new data built in and an updated version of the tool by early March every year. We were right around that point this year, updated it late February. So that's something that will be done annually. At the same time, the MIT Living Wage Calculator, for those of you who have used that, they update that quarterly. And so we just tried to align our February update with their March, February release. It came a little early this year, which allowed us to get our work updated at about the same time. In terms of undocumented workers, so there is only one area right now where we have information on, excuse me a second, on citizenship status, and that is with this big mess of a tool that we showed to compute the probability of earning a living wage. This actually came out of users who were working with version 1 of this tool, asked if we could incorporate a citizenship component on here. If you're familiar with how the US Census Bureau asks about citizenship, effectively it just asks if you were born in the US and if you're a citizen through birth, if you were born abroad to American parents, or if you were born abroad and you are not a citizen. And so we just have that as a binary feature on this tool right now. That doesn't necessarily get into status with respect to documentation and legal work papers in the US, but you can at least introduce this citizenship analysis into any study of what is the likelihood of somebody earning a living wage. But I should note there that even that addition came through these types of conversations, through folks using the data, asking us if it was possible to expand, and then us making sure that we're able to build that in. So any questions like that, future expansions, we would strongly encourage everyone to reach out, because if we can do it, then the next time we update it, we'll try to do it.
And that leads sort of into another question. What are some other groups or categorizations folks would love to see in the data? And I'd love to have folks put that in the Q&A, but also Karen and Yannet, if you have ideas or places where you've seen other groups that are specifically impacted by minimum wage or living wage that are not in our data, it's something, as Rusty said, that we want to include. So I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
So what about collective bargaining agreements? How's that represented?
Unfortunately, it is not right now, but I'll say this is an exciting project that we have going on. Our collab in Buffalo partnered with the Worker Institute at the ILR school. We are working on trying to make the data set that we use to power the Wage Atlas talk to another data set through some modeling activities that is typically used to identify whether or not a worker is a union member or covered by a union's collective bargaining agreement. So I'm optimistic that we will have that rolled out in our third version at this time next year, after the 2023 update from the Census Bureau. So that is something we're working on. It's not in there yet, but there are active designs to have it happen, and we're doing some of the testing behind the scenes right now.
Thank you.
So I don't work on gig workers, but I am curious as to whether we can incorporate the gig workers into some of these calculations. I don't recall whether or not New York State or New York City have a law that now does not allow employers to classify gig workers, or at least some of them, as self-employed contractors. But if that is, again, the gig worker impact may be something to think about for the future.
That's a great point. And so the data that we do have allows us to identify someone who's self-employed. Again, the way that they respond to the Census Bureau's questionnaire won't allow us to see if they are a gig worker per se, but it at least allows us to see if they report that they work for themselves, potentially as an independent contractor. And so doing an occupation level analysis of those folks who identify as self-employed might give us some insights into who might be a gig worker or not. Where we've used that fairly extensively for some of the work that we do in Western New York is looking at childcare providers, like Dr. King mentioned. There are a number of providers who are family-based or group family-based daycares who operate out of their home. And so looking at compensation, effective compensation for those workers in particular has been very illuminating. There are folks that earn negative income after everything is accounted for at their household scale. And certainly most of them earn sub-minimum wages because of their self-employed status as childcare workers. So that's one way that we've been able to use that particular attribute in conjunction with these tools.
Another question that came from the audience that can kind of go to either Rusty or others on the panel is, does this tool allow us to see the impact on businesses that cannot afford these wages? That's sort of the Rusty question. And then more broadly, what is the impact of raising wages on businesses? Does inflation creep in? I'm curious what the other panelists as well have to say on those questions.
Yeah, so on the second part of that, I'll defer to Yannet and some of what she's probably encountered in her campaigns. I will say that there's always going to be, if minimum wage is rapidly increased in a short amount of time, there's always going to be some friction, which is why I qualified everything that I was saying with some of those tools is, imagine that we can do this and we just get to that next step, that long run outcome. But there are going to be employers that face steep costs and won't find it feasible to make those increases. I hate to keep using the same example, but the childcare workforce really comes to mind there. We've been inside of the books of some of these providers who have sat down with us and they don't have any margins for increasing worker wages, which is why the industry is seeing some employment attrition and employees going to other establishments where they can earn more. And so there will be circumstances like that. And I can't necessarily speak to that, but I will say there have been independent economists who have studied proposals to increase New York State's minimum wage. In particular, there is a group that looked at the initial proposal to increase New York State's minimum wage to $15 an hour from when it was around $9, which would be about a $6 per hour increase. And what that study found was that it wouldn't have an effect, a substantive effect on jobs, the number of jobs in the economy, that they wouldn't forecast significant job losses. In a reflective piece just last year, the same authors looked back at their predictions and said that it was correct, right? Looking at the number of jobs in the economy over time, there weren't large-scale job losses as a result of these step-ups in minimum wage. And that led into those same analysts doing or replicating their work for a $21.25 per hour minimum wage, as in the Raise Up New York bill. Thought I put guards against that, sorry. Motion sensor lights. And the analysts basically made the same contention that they wouldn't anticipate large-scale losses of jobs. Again, that's not to say that job loss won't happen at the enterprise level for particular establishments, but in the aggregates, the assumption is that we wouldn't see widespread job losses from going to, say, a $21.25 per hour minimum wage.
And I'll add to that employers typically, and it does vary by employer, I'm sure, but typically they do have some ways of adjusting to higher minimum wage, especially if it's phased in over time. It could be demanding more productivity from their employees. Paying a higher wage may keep workers from trying to find another job, so that lowers the cost of turnover for them. Excuse me, and to be real, they might need to adjust some prices. So that may be another channel of adjustment. Now that takes us to inflation. What I understand is that minimum wages, because we're talking about low wage workers, and we're talking about typically like $1.50 per hour increase. We're talking about very modest minimum wage increases. So the impact on inflation overall is not going to be there much. You may see like a 10-cent or 50-cent increase in some things. And this is like when we're not talking about, like what we've seen in the past couple of years, supply chain issues due to COVID and other things. So when we're talking about just regular times, inflation or minimum wages typically do not have much of an impact on inflation. There are other things that, again, going back to supply chains, that's one thing that might have a bigger impact on inflation than higher minimum wages. Other things, like the cost of energy, housing sometimes can be volatile, but it also like a very important a factor for what we're looking at as far as inflation. So there are other things. Typically, minimum wages are not that impactful.
Thanks, Yannet. I'm curious, Karen, for, you really looking at equity, both, at wages, but across the board. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why wages are so important to equity and specifically around gender, but, more broadly, especially when we're talking about living wages that also factor in cost of living. We looked at childcare and other things. How does this all tie together when we're talking about equity and participation by various segments of society and the workforce?
Well, we live in a capitalist society, and money is king. So the more money you have, the more choices you have, the more power you have to make informed choices. So money matters. It gives people a safety net. It gives them a platform to live a certain type of life, where they're not making a choice between putting food on their table or gas in their car. Maybe they're making a decision about, well, maybe we'll go to Disney World or maybe we'll go somewhere else, right? So when capitalism is the anchor, money is always going to be the issue. And wages, if you want people to contribute to the economy so they can buy more stuff, because that's what we're supposed to be doing, is consuming products, and then they have to have the money to do it. And they're not going to have the money to do it if you don't pay them more. And so it's a really interesting dilemma, because of course capitalism doesn't really care about equity. We care about equity because of our democratic principles of fairness. So it's an interesting relationship between equity and social justice and capitalism. So it's a troublesome relationship.
Thanks for that. And I'm curious too, that one of the relationships between wages and sort of the broader economic engines that you were mentioning, Karen, one of the things that has been pointed out over the years is this broader decoupling or general decoupling from worker productivity and minimum wages. And Yannet, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that separation. What does that mean for wages to have decoupled from worker productivity? And what are the implications of that?
Sure. So we would need to go back a few decades. In 1968, more or less, that's when the minimum wage was at its peak. Starting in I think it was the late 1970s, there were a number of policies that were adopted that made that decoupling possible. First of all, one of the things that happened was that, or a few things that happened was that minimum wages were not increased as often as they were in the past, and not by a whole lot. So that definitely was one of the decoupling things. Other things were the deregulation of the economy in many ways led to the coupled with the slower and less frequent increases in minimum wage, the trajectories of both the productivity of workers, of the economy, and the wages of workers sort of took different paths. And we have seen over the years that minimum wages have not really kept up with productivity. And up until recently, they were more or less flat. They're a little bit increasing right now, but they were more or less flat. What does it mean is that the practical implications of that is that over the years, the minimum wage has lost not only its value, but it also has lost. It has not increased at the rate it should. So workers are now sharing less and less of the products of their labor. When productivity increases, obviously, many groups of people can benefit. Workers being one of them, but we're just seeing less of that now than in the past.
Rusty, has worker productivity been something you've thought about including in the tool, or making that comparison more broadly?
Yeah, so it's difficult to integrate into what we have, just because the resolution of the data on worker productivity tends to be a bit coarser than what we're working with here. I will say, and I can drop this in the chat, Dr. Ian Greer in the Ithaca Collab and the Buffalo Collab here, we recently released a data brief on this same topic, looking at the loss in workers' share of their productivity gains by examining what the minimum wage would be today if it had continued to follow on that pre-1968 trajectory that Yannet had mentioned. And so I can drop a link to that in the chat, but it does show, see, I can probably bring it up here. It does show what the gap kind of looks like, and how we did have a history of trying to make sure that minimum wage earners saw their purchasing power either stay the same or increase as productivity was increasing. And then that kind of just fell off of a cliff. And now we're at this point where productivity has still been rising, even in the course of the pandemic, but minimum wage has not. And so workers who are earning at that level don't get to see their purchasing power increase. In fact, they tend to see their purchasing power decrease over time.
Thanks, Rusty. I'm also curious for researchers from other states, this is a New York State focused tool. I'm curious if researchers from other states wanted to replicate something like this for their state or regions, what would they need to do? And sort of, do you have information on that on some of the tools web pages?
Sure. So everything that goes into the tools that we demonstrated that you just saw and can go play around with are all public data that are available nationwide. So we draw on three main sources to have all of the tools work together. I already mentioned the US Census American Community Survey public use microdata samples. Certainly the MIT Living Wage Calculator is where we get the information on what a living wage would be for a certain worker in the state. And then the US Bureau of Economic Analysis economic multipliers for the state of New York. So those three data sets can be or give information for everywhere across the US. It's certainly possible to take an atlas like this and make it national. Get into a pretty large data set at that point, so things might drag and be a little slower as you work with the tools. So perhaps doing it at a state-by-state level is one of those sweet spots where it becomes a little easier to work with the tools without a lot of lag. But it's just cutting up those data. So we have instructions in that About an FAQ section on how to derive estimates for hourly worker wages from the data that are provided by workers to the US Census Bureau. We have a description of the geographic units at which they're available. That's something that's consistent across all states. They're available at the same geographies. And then we talk about the temporal issues of the data sets as well. And so there should be a lot of meat in that way too long about and methodology section where users could go and see how to build something like this in a different location.
Thanks. We're coming up close to our closing time, so I want to get some sort of last thoughts and open it up for discussion. The strength of the Wage Atlas is that it goes beyond statewide averages and really looks deeply at these economic conditions of different industries at different parts of the state. And I'm curious if all the panelists could sort of talk about what they see as the most critical pieces of the Atlas that or generally about wages that they can use to construct policy to close that living wage gap for more New Yorkers, or nationally, should we be able to see more of these wage atlases in other regions? Where would we like to see these numbers change? Like, where are we seeing these great disparities, and where are the places the policymakers should really be focusing when they're thinking about raising wages or trying to create policy that addresses folks who are at the red lower median wage scale that we saw in the Atlas? And Karen, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm very curious to know, you keep talking about worker productivity, and Rusty, when you just showed the graph and how it was more aligned in the 50s and early 60s, and of course, when you say productivity, you mean the profit margin for
economic output, so stuff, right? Making
say that
stuff.
Again?
Economic productivity. So the production of commodities, basically, for lack of a better term.
So it's an important framing, because worker productivity, it makes it look like, well, workers aren't being productive. They're being productive, but the business owners are making a huge profit, and the wages aren't keeping up with that profit, so they're flattening, and they can't keep up. So this is an economic model that is not serving most people who are working in the United States. I think that's the bigger macro issue. And then, of course, to discuss the way people who provide a particular type of labor, like childcare providers, childcare workers, people who work in fast, that's not just low paying work, it's also considered low status, right? If you saw, what was it, the people that sell commodities and stocks, and did you see the disparity between the 75th percentile and the 20? It's staggering. So we attach greater value, status, and we pay people more money who work with money. So I think this atlas really points out these disparities in very clear and glaring ways. So it's a really important tool.
Thanks. Yannet, could you talk a little bit about where you'd like to see these numbers change and how policymakers might get us there?
Well, I would love to see the probabilities of earning a living wage for some of these low-paying occupations, be higher. So obviously that's in a general sense. What Dr. King mentions about childcare workers is, that's one of the tricky parts of when we talk about minimum wages and low wage occupations. Some of the care jobs that are, very labor intensive by necessity are the trickier ones, because there aren't some margins that we need to consider to take into account. So I don't know what that means for like raising wages so that those workers also are able to benefit without huge impacts on the industry. It may mean some sort of subsidies. I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's something that is an ongoing issue that I think some folks are trying to think about and how to address. But yeah, it's a hard one.
And
But
Rusty, oh,
yes, sorry, just to say that, yeah, for sure, this atlas has a wealth of information, and especially for the information about how we want to see these numbers change. That's helpful.
thanks, Yannet. And Rusty, as somebody who created this atlas, I'm curious, how, especially and has spent so much time in it, where would you like to see policymakers use this and take it, as we go forward?
Sure. So it connects back with a question that you asked earlier too on what would be the impact, maybe it came from the audience, and what would be the impact on some employers. I think one of the ways that we can start to see some of these numbers change as the Atlas tries to simulate is by raising the minimum wage to ensure that workers are being compensated at a level that's more reflective of the gains in economic productivity that have happened since the last time we saw a minimum wage increase. And of course, while that is going to result in some short-term hardship, maybe for some employers, I often get asked the question, well, if we do raise the minimum wage, employers are going to have to shut down, people are going to lose their jobs. The minimum wage only applies to employees. And so this opens the door for things like funding for worker co-op conversions and making employees owners of an establishment and giving them more buy-in. Not only does a higher minimum wage decrease turnover and make it more cost-effective for employers to retain employees, but if there's a hardship that needs to be overcome, and one strategy for that might be to extend ownership opportunities to your employees, that is also another upward, it also promotes upward economic mobility. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if we raise the minimum wage, we're going to put everything on the backs of employers with small margins. We might just have a different conversation there about how those employers can remain operational by making their employees not employees anymore, but co-owners. And so I think that's, looking at numbers like this, it opens the door for broader policy conversations rather than just looking at one specific solution. We might think about an ecosystem of interacting policy changes that could make it easier for us to raise the minimum wage on one hand, but keep people in business and keep establishments running on the other.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you. And I want to that seems like a good place to wrap it up. So we'll conclude there, but I want to thank everyone for coming and thank our panelists for their time and expertise. I want to remind folks that there's a Wage Atlas link in the chat, and you can find it by Googling Wage Atlas, Cornell ILR. There's also much other content that you can find on the ILR website and on the CARO Center for Applied Research on Work website, and you can go there to sign up for notifications about future events, connecting sort of a lot more of these conversations. So we look forward to seeing you at future discussions, and thanks again for our panelists and your time and expertise. Have a great day, everyone.